that the liability waiver is signed and filed with the village committee. From this moment on, whether they get rich or lose everything is no longer his concern. He drops those words coldly, steps into his truck, and shuts the door. He floors the accelerator, leaving behind the mocking laughter of his uncle and the neighbors. After leaving that forgotten valley, Ethan drives straight to the home of an old, trusted friend. He knows that while others see his old industrial motor as mere scrap metal, it's a different story when it's in the hands of someone who actually understands farming. In the right hands, it is a tool that can quite literally save lives. He spends 3 days scouting the area until he finally finds a massive, empty wasteland. It's a vast stretch of land, covering roughly 16 or 17 acres. The rent for this particular plot is incredibly cheap, and for one very good reason. You see, the water table here is buried far too deep for normal wells. Standard domestic agricultural water pumps simply aren't up to the task here. They can't draw water at all, and even if they manage a trickle, the amount is miserable. It wouldn't even be enough to irrigate a fraction of this massive plot. Everyone who tried to lease this land before failed because they couldn't solve the water problem. They lost every cent of their capital and left with their tails between their legs. But Ethan isn't worried. The first thing he does after leasing the land is hire a professional team to drill a deep well. Then, he firmly mounts that grease-covered, traditional old motor onto the base. The very moment he flips the switch, the engine lets out a loud, deep roar, sounding like a beast that has just woken up. Suddenly, a jet of water as thick as a man's arm erupts violently from dozens of meters underground. With enough water, he knows the rest will be easy. He leans on his 8 years of farming experience, which helps him get the job done right. With this high-powered irrigation, he begins planting high-value organic cherries in this cheap red soil, along with premium seedless grapes. His life begins to move as if he had pressed the fast-forward button, heading day by day toward what looks to be a magnificent harvest. Meanwhile, back in the village, they are submerged in a false bustle of modernization. The Liyuan company arrived with a very pretty-looking new pump, complete with a shiny stainless steel casing and covered in colorful high-tech stickers. To top it all off, it even came with a large, fancy touchscreen. And, of course, it boasted the immense power of modern technology, featuring a tactile LCD screen that looked 100 times better than Ethan's old motor. Our story's uncle, being the one who brought in the investment, suddenly became the most popular man in the entire village. The Liyuan company went out of its way to secure his support as the local authority, ensuring everything went their way. They didn't just give him a handsome commission, they also awarded him the contracts for the small pipeline construction projects throughout the village. Back then, the uncle was truly in his prime, basking in the glow of his newfound importance. Every day he paraded through the village with his little project folder, putting on the airs of a major contractor. He walked tall, fueled by the money obtained from selling off the village's very source of life. He bought a massive quantity of red bricks and cement and began managing the construction of his own monument. In the most visible spot in the center of town, he started building a 3-story house with a grand terrace. The villagers, with hose over their shoulders, looked on with hope at the new black plastic pipes being laid in the fields. However, when they squeezed them by hand, the reality was a bit different than the promise. The pipes felt soft, and the walls were as thin as a sheet of paper, hardly the stuff of legends. But in the uncle's mouth, this was rebranded as aerospace-grade polymer material, which sounds much more impressive, doesn't it? Everyone dreamed of getting rich, thinking that without any further worries, they could finally move up in the world. They believed they would enjoy cheap, clean water just like the people in the big cities do. But they didn't know that in the hands of fate, things that seem free have often already hidden their true price. The dream shattered during the very first month when it came time to actually pay for the water. It was late May, the critical time when the fruit trees are blooming and the harvest is beginning to set. The demand for water was growing more and more intense with each passing day. The Liyuan company's debt collector set up a table and sat with complete audacity right in the village committee's courtyard. And right next to him, he placed a sign with a QR code for payments, a modern touch for our villagers to admire. He announced that everyone should come to the committee to pay this month's bill and activate their smart IC cards. To ensure her irrigation wasn't interrupted, Aunt Wendy was among the very first to arrive. She held a few crumpled bills tightly in her hand as she approached the table. Her face still wore the cheerful smile of someone who believes they've found a bargain as she addressed the young man. She explained that for her small hillside plot, she only managed a couple of acres. Back when Ethan was in charge, she remembered that her monthly costs were quite manageable. In those days, she usually paid about $12 or $13 for the electricity to run the pump. She mentioned how her brother, the uncle, had promised this quality water would be half the price of the old way. She offered $10, innocently asking if that would be enough to cover her for the entire month. The collector was a young man with dyed yellow hair who didn't seem particularly interested in small talk. Without even looking up, he continued chewing his gum and took Aunt Wendy's card from her hand. He swiped it through the machine, which responded with a sharp, clinical beep. After tapping a few keys, the machine began to spit out a receipt that seemed over 3 feet long. He confirmed her name was Wendy and handed over the bill with total indifference. The total for the month came to $248, quite a leap from 10. He asked if she was paying with the code or cash, warning her that if the balance wasn't settled, the water would be cut off by tomorrow. Aunt Wendy's smile froze on her face instantly. The few bills she was holding nearly slipped from her fingers and fell to the dusty ground. Thinking she must have misheard him, her legs went weak and she nearly stumbled right then and there. She stammered in disbelief, asking if he had really said over $240. She suggested that perhaps the young man had simply misplaced a decimal point by mistake. She accused them of robbery, unable to fathom paying hundreds for such a tiny plot of land. Aunt Wendy's shout echoed through the air, leaving the rest of the waiting villagers completely stunned. The young man with the yellow hair simply rolled his eyes in response to her outburst. With an impatient sigh, he used his pen to point at the receipt, which was cluttered with various charges. He told her that even if she couldn't read, she still needed to be reasonable about the situation. He insisted it was all there in black and white, directing her attention to the very first line. The basic water rate was actually quite cheap, only about 15 cents per ton. That was much lower than what Ethan used to charge her, or so he claimed anyway. But this was a modern smart network, and we see that one doesn't just pay for the water itself. The second item was a monthly service fee for the smart platform, totaling $30. Then came the third item, $80 a month for pipe depreciation and daily maintenance costs. Fourth, since the village sits on a mountain, there was a shared cost for tiered pumping electricity. On top of that, there were rental fees for the smart meter and even a charge for adding trace elements. When everything was added up, that was the price, and that was supposedly with a company subsidy. The villagers began to whisper that Wendy should never have signed that contract with her thumbprint. They warned her not to swipe the card, but the collector snapped that the tap was on their own land. He coldly pointed out that no one had forced them to use it, a statement of pure, calculated absurdity. Aunt Wendy stood there trembling, wondering how a simple blessing of water had turned into such a burden. The news of what had happened to her spread through the village as if it had grown wings of its own. Everyone was absolutely stunned, remembering how things used to be when Ethan was still in charge. Back then, he had bought the motor himself and repaired the pipes personally, only ever charging for the basics. He had billed the pumping electricity at the exact state grid rate, without adding a single cent for himself. But now the Lu Yuan company had arrived, and things were handled quite differently. They applied the favorite method of big business, itemized fees and hidden surcharges at every turn. They were packing the bill with all sorts of invented service charges that no one had ever heard of before. In the end, for the exact same plot of land they had always farmed, the total cost had multiplied dozens of times over, a truly staggering increase. The village reached a breaking point, and we see that every single resident was now completely furious. These were women who would normally haggle for half an hour at the market over a few cents for vegetables. Now, their hearts were practically bleeding with rage at such a blatant injustice. Hundreds of people swarmed into the center of the village, their voices rising in a collective roar. They surrounded the three-story house that was still being built for Uncle Ian. They screamed for the coward to come out, reminding him he had promised the water would be half the price. They accused him of using the money from the land sales to build himself a grand mansion. The crowd demanded to know if he was collaborating with the company to scam his own neighbors. At that very moment, Uncle Ian was up on the second floor, admiring his new, spacious terrace. Seeing the angry mob gathered below, he quickly straightened his clothes to look presentable. He walked out with an air of self-importance, though deep down, he felt a sudden wave of insecurity. The truth was, he had only just learned about the company's actual rates himself, but he had already pocketed a $50,000 bribe. Yes, naturally. So he had no choice but to keep lying with absolute, shameless confidence. He asked them what all the fuss was about, calling them short-sighted for complaining. He reminded them that this was a major provincial corporation with a reputation to uphold. He argued that a company of that scale obviously needed to recover its initial costs. He told them they were focusing far too much on the water bill right in front of them. They needed to think bigger, he claimed, insisting their water was packed with special nutrients. According to him, the water had undergone a process of high-tech filtration. He called it an investment, suggesting that spending a few hundred more now was wise. He promised that by autumn, their fruit would be so large and shiny that big city supermarkets would pay them $3 or $5 more per pound for the harvest. Those small water fees would be recovered 10 times over, or so he claimed. He warned that if they were too stingy to pay, their fruit would end up the size of a walnut, and they would only have their own narrow-mindedness to blame. The villagers were momentarily intimidated by this speech, which was a masterful blend of half-truths. Deep down, it hurt them deeply, but looking at the pipes already installed, they felt trapped. After all, the old pump had been removed and the well sealed by the Lu Yuan company. There was no remedy. They simply had to grit their teeth and swallow the bitter pill. To save money, the villagers began to ration their water, turning deep irrigation into a trickle. They only dared to open the valves for 10 minutes to dampen the soil before pulling their cards. Where they used to pay every 10 days, they now stretched it to 15 or even 20. But fruit trees do not lie. Without enough water, the leaves that should have been lush began to yellow and wither, and the tender young fruit stopped growing once it reached the size of a small coin. The entire village was soon smothered in an atmosphere of oppression and anxiety. They could only pray in silence for heavy rains to save them from that cursed and expensive water bill. They had no way of knowing that the heavens have no mercy, and an abnormal weather pattern was about to bring the village to ruin with a century-level drought. In mid-July, it arrived. An unprecedented summer drought took hold, and for 45 whole days, not a single drop of rain fell. The village stream, where they once washed their clothes, had already completely dried up too. Weeks prior, leaving only a cracked bed where even the eels had turned into dried-out husks. In any other year, this would be the critical period for the fruit trees to set their crop. They couldn't go a day without water, yet this year, due to the predatory rates of the Lu Yuan Company, not a single villager dared to irrigate freely. The first to suffer was Aunt Annie, who had her land halfway up the slope. Her 2 acres of apple trees supported her entire family. But now the leaves were yellow and curling at the edges. If you touched them,